started. I want you to look at this gentleman right here and see if you can figure out who he is. Probably some of you already know who he is, and other ones, he may look familiar. But let me tell you about this. This is, as you see right down here, this is the Fort Myers, Florida high school class of 1924. Young people who hopefully all had good long lives. This young lady right here in the back, that is my grandmother. That's my mother's mother. And my mother was also a graduate of Fort Myers, Florida High School back in 1947. They had a house. The house that my grandmother and her family had was on Larchmont. I think it was Larchmont Avenue or Street. But it ran parallel to this gentleman's laboratory. This guy is very well known. And if you hadn't figured it out yet, this is Thomas Edison. And this is one of the early Fort Myers, one of his most famous residents. And I say one of because he had some buddies that he told how nice Fort Myers was, and they built houses down there too, namely Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone. And they all had houses just kind of right next to each other, right by the Caloosahatchee River. And Thomas Edison would come down in the winter and had his laboratory there and worked with his team to come up with all kinds of things. But just to kind of put in an idea of how fast things have changed in the history of mankind, think about this. This guy, I think one of the things that he's most known for is that he and his team came up with the light bulb. So before this guy right here, from the beginning of mankind, the very first man, all the way up to this guy, once the sun went down, we, in order to see after dark, had to use some type of flame. Okay, kind of think about that. This guy, who had his picture taken with my grandmother, his team came up with the light bulb, which allowed us to see after dark, and all the electricity and everything else that went into it. There have been a lot of changes that have happened in the past 100 years. All right, and along with those changes, through the Industrial Revolution, drawing on the work of Adam Smith, we've learned a lot about how organizations can and hopefully should work. So let me just kind of introduce this, and in Blackboard, it'll have the assignments and links to videos and some readings that I'd like for you to do. So again, last week, or at the beginning of this, I did the little talk on Adam Smith, and I hinted at the very end about Frederick Taylor and then the Hawthorne studies. So introducing the book, I think in order to make sense of organizational behavior and how it's different and really better adds to those ideas of Adam Smith, we kind of need to understand the background a little bit better. So let's look at, and I'm going to leave some people out who are mentioned in the book. If you want additional study, I encourage you to do additional study on Mary Parker Follett, Chester Bernard, other folks. But I wanted to hit in particular Frederick Winslow Taylor. You'll watch the video, got a great video. Actually, there are a couple, one from ABC News and then one that someone else put together. And then I'd really like for you to go in and read his congressional testimony. I just read it this morning. It's wonderful. Just kind of going back in time and reading exactly what he said. And I'm going to take him at his word for actually saying what he thought and not trying to sugarcoat it, especially when you're sworn in front of Congress. So picturing his time, based on those ideas of Adam Smith, division of labor, we saw those humongous gains in productivity by dividing up labor instead of everybody doing it by themselves. So from the late 1700s, and now we're into the 1900s, late 1800s and into the 1900s, Frederick Taylor, the thinking of organizations back then was this kind of separation of management and workers. The idea that the management are the ones who should think and come up with a plan and figure out how work is going to be done. And then the workers need to enact that. And so they're not really to think, they're just kind of fit into this machine and do their parts. And they get paid for it, and they shouldn't complain about it because they're getting paid for it. Okay, there's more to that. Okay, what Frederick Taylor said, and I think it's on page 102 in this reading that I'm going to give you. Look on page 102 of the printed, and then over on the right-hand column, about halfway down, said, let me tell you what scientific management is not. And then from what it is not, then let me tell you what it is. And he describes it as a mental revolution. that we have to change the way we think, particularly over how we divide the surplus revenue. I wrote surplus profit, but it should be surplus revenue. How we divide the surplus revenue. There's been this classic battle, and I think you'll see it in one of the management briefs, this classic battle over who gets to keep the profit. Okay, the revenue brought in above cost. And the owner's argument is, well, we set this organization up, we took the risk, we put it all in place, we have paid you your wage, we get the profit. The worker's argument is, if it weren't for us, you would just have empty buildings and unused equipment. If it weren't for us, there would be no revenue or profit to begin with. And so this classic battle over who is entitled to the profit, the excess revenue. What Fred Taylor says is that if we come up with a better way of doing things, find the most efficient way to do stuff. Efficiency is that ratio of inputs to outputs. If we can make our work more efficient and better, we can then produce more. And when we produce more, we can sell more, we can have more revenue. And if you think about your relationship between fixed cost and variable cost, if we're producing more of these things, but our fixed costs are kind of staying the same, then we're going to see that the profit is going to increase. So he says if we pull together in the same direction, the workers and the owners, instead of pulling against each other, if we both work together, we can produce more profit than we can produce more profit, way more profit than what we used to be able to fight over. So if you do your kind of an analysis of revenue and fixed cost and variable cost, and then your profits here, if we would work together, we could then produce way more profit. And so that which we used to fight over in total, we can now maybe have all of that ourselves plus more. So if we work together, okay, in a more efficient way and change the way that we don't want people to work slowly, kind of that soldiering idea, but if we could speed them up, maybe paying them per piece and aligning the interest of the workers and the owners, that we're all going to benefit from this together. He also said that they should be able to share this. And so just because it looks like the workers are making more than they did when they were getting paid on an hourly wage, when they were trying to slow down because they were afraid that they would be fired if they actually produced more, okay, all those arguments, he said, no, we have to work together as a team, okay, produce more than we ever possibly need or have imagined before, and then share in that. Now, unfortunately, I think what most of us realize is that the sharing didn't really happen to the extent that probably could have and should have. So I encourage you, read through. I read the whole first section. There are actually 2 sections. I read the first section this morning. Fascinating reading, but particularly from about that middle of page 102 through 104, where he really kind of outlines what it's all about. And he'll talk about the surplus revenue as well. So that is Fred Taylor. Again, a couple videos and then that reading of from the congressional testimony. Take a look at that, and I'll ask you some reflection questions on that. The other one, which is so big and important, so this took the ideas from Adam Smith, from Fred Taylor. They set up the illumination studies originally with the light bulbs. And if you think about this machine metaphor that they kind of use to understand organizations, it makes sense. What's the optimal speed at which you can rev an engine that brings about performance? When you on a stereo, how loud can I turn it up before it starts to distort? This idea, if you have this relationship between illumination, light in the building, and performance, if it's pitch black, you won't be able to see anything, and so performance is not going to be that great. But if it's as bright as the sun, obviously no one will be able to see. So there, in our mind, intuitively, it makes sense that at a certain point the lights are going to be too dim. After a certain point they're going to be too bright. So what's this optimal range of brightness to have in the room? So they did the illumination studies first, and they were confused. The results came out, they kind of confounded what they were interested in examining. And so they said, we need to follow up on it. And so those were the relay assembly room studies. Now, I've also provided actually one video, but that one video, it looks like 1974. And talking about my grandmother, they look like my grandparents back in 1974. And actually, some of them are probably about the same age as my grandmother in that picture earlier. But it was kind of a reunion, probably almost 50 years, 40 to 50 years later. After those studies, we got those people back together and took a video of kind of them getting back together. But then inside of it, there's a little documentary as well that kind of tells. So I encourage you to take a watch of that. And then also I've provided a link over to the Harvard website where it has pictures and results and stories from the actual studies themselves, which are not that long ago in my grandparents' age. So with this one, what they did is they did the illumination studies, then they pulled the folks out into the relay assembly room. They watched them for 5 years. They altered the time and the conditions of work, primarily time and breaks, and allowed them to talk and interact. They asked the people, before they changed these experimental conditions, they asked the people that were in these experiments, what do you think about this? Would this be okay? And gave them time to talk and discuss. Again, machine parts don't get asked by the engineers if that's okay. Things were starting to change. They started to involve the employees in the decisions and brought about different feelings inside of them. So wonderful. I was going to get it from my office, but I just kind of wrote it out. I've got a study kind of on the conclusion of this. And they said the only apparent uniformity across these 5 years of studies where they manipulated when you stop, when you start, your break times, all these different experimental conditions. They said the only apparent uniformity across these 5 years of studies was that performance increased in each successive experimental condition. And even at the end, when they went back to the original hours and conditions of one of the first experiments, they said it really wasn't the same. A lot had happened between there. So even though they're working the same hours in a much later condition compared to an earlier condition, it was an entirely different workplace. Okay, so with that, and you'll hear when you study and watch these things on the Hawthorne studies or the Western Electric studies, they talk about attitudes, and they started becoming aware that people have attitudes. Those who did leadership, we know that attitudes, there are 3 dimensions: affective, behavioral, cognitive, A, B, C. Affective is the emotions, cognitive is the thinking, and then the behavioral is the do. It's the think, feel, and do. So your attitude about something, an evaluative belief about something in particular. So you have attitudes about all different things, but you can have attitudes about work. You can have attitudes about your coworkers. You can have attitudes about your supervisors. You can have attitudes about your pay. And we'll play with those more later in a couple weeks. So attitudes. So what you think and feel about something is then going to reflect back in what you do. And in particular, in relation to management and work, what you think and feel about your work and the people you're working with and where you're working, that's going to reflect in what you do. And do is going to be related to performance. So very interesting. So Hawthorne studies, they kind of went in with, I think, kind of this machine metaphor. Let's figure out the optimal brightness. And then it got messed up because people were reacting not based on the brightness, but because they based on expectations, what they thought the expectations were. And so they pulled that out and they studied these people for 5 years and came up with these conclusions. Now, if you go back and look, it wasn't too long ago where some people came forward and kind of questioned the methodology of the Hawthorne studies, but I don't think it matters. What happened was we came to the conclusion, yes, that people are people, and if you treat them well with respect, make them feel involved and appreciated, and some say in their work, that you can get results that are far superior to simply dividing up the work and giving them boring, dull, monotonous work. So the Hawthorne studies really gave birth to what we call the human relations field, which then became organizational behavior. So back in the 40s, when we realized that, hey, we needed to pay attention to people, what happened was the management people, who had always really just been kind of Adam Smith, economics, and organization theory people, they all of a sudden said, hey, we need to understand people. And so they ran around what I see as kind of college campuses. They ran around college campuses trying to find things, concepts, theories that would be useful to study people within organizations. So they ended up in psychology. They ended up in sociology. They maybe ended up in anthropology. They ended up over in the science areas, just kind of scouring the campuses to find ideas that could be used over in the management and business area to help us understand organizations as social systems, as made up of people and the feelings and personalities, but then you put them together in groups and other things happen, and then you put them together in organizations, other things happen, and then they exist within a bigger environment. So really the field of org behavior, this human relations era, kind of began back in the 40s, and then really kind of took off and grew and developed, kind of developing through the 50s and 60s. And then we've just had a lot of wonderful, interesting ideas and research done since then.